Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Caldwell townhouse on Beacon Hill, washing the marble kitchen in a pale gold glow. Emma Caldwell stood by the counter, her hand still, eyes fixed on the skyline of Boston that stretched beyond the window. The city shimmered with the quiet elegance of wealth, brownstone facades, iron balconies, a street where old money didn't need to prove itself. Yet in the middle of it, Emma always felt like an intruder. 2 years had passed since she'd moved here, and the silence of the house still felt foreign, like a museum she was allowed to clean but not belong to. Behind her, the rhythmic tap of heels broke the morning calm. Victoria Caldwell entered the kitchen, composed as ever, silk robe, hair pinned perfectly, her perfume arriving before her voice. She carried a folder in one hand, the corners of her lips tightening as she looked at Emma. "The caterers will arrive at 5, she began. "Make sure the flowers are arranged the way I told you. White lilies, not those wild things you ordered last time." "Yes, Mrs. Caldwell," Emma replied softly, keeping her gaze low. Victoria placed the folder on the counter and began flipping through pages. "Tonight is important," she continued. "There will be people here who matter. Judges, investors, members of the city council. It would be better if you didn't try to make conversation. Smile, be polite, and let Andrew introduce you when necessary." Her tone was polished, but the insult hid right beneath it. Emma heard it, as always. "Know your place." "I understand," Emma said quietly. Victoria looked up, studying her daughter-in-law's calm face. "Good. You have a tendency to overshare, dear. People from smaller places don't always understand discretion." Emma's chest tightened, but she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll remember that." Satisfied, Victoria gave a brief nod and adjusted the cuffs of her robe. "I'm sure you will." She turned toward the door, pausing for a moment. "Oh, and wear something simple tonight. We wouldn't want anyone thinking you're trying too hard." When she left, the faint click of her heels faded up the staircase. The kitchen fell back into stillness. Emma stood motionless for a moment, staring at the reflection of sunlight on the counter. The words echoed in her mind, every subtle dismissal, every reminder that she was only tolerated, never accepted. She exhaled slowly, pressing her palm against the cold marble. Her phone buzzed. The vibration startled her in the silence. She glanced at the screen. Samuel Lewis, her uncle. She answered almost immediately. "Uncle Sam." His voice carried the warmth of Wyoming's open plains, a sound she hadn't heard in months. "Emma, sweetheart, I didn't mean to call so early, but I thought you should know. It's done." Her breath caught. "Done?" "Yes. Everything we've worked for these past 3 years. The court signed the final order yesterday. The land is officially back under your family's name." Emma gripped the phone tighter. For a second, she couldn't speak. The ranch, her grandfather's land, was finally hers again. The injustice her family had carried for decades was ending. Samuel continued, his tone softer now. "It's all real, Emma. The deeds, the records, the injunctions, they're final. The Caldwell, people can't touch it anymore." She leaned against the counter, feeling her knees weaken. "I don't even know what to say." "Don't say anything yet." There was a pause on the other end, the rustle of papers. "Your mother would be proud. But listen, tonight's that woman's birthday, isn't it?" Emma blinked. "Victoria's?" "Yes. She's throwing some sort of showcase. Judges, developers, everyone from her circle." Samuel hummed quietly. "Then that's perfect." Emma straightened. "Uncle Sam, what are you planning?" There was a trace of amusement in his voice, but beneath it, something heavy, deliberate. "You'll see. Let's just say it's time for the truth to stand in the same room as their lies." The call ended, leaving Emma in silence once more. She looked around the vast kitchen, the gleaming counters, the crystal light fixtures, the carefully arranged perfection. For the first time, the house no longer felt intimidating. It felt temporary, like a stage waiting for its final act. She placed her phone down and whispered to herself, almost as if to confirm what she already knew. It's time. Samuel's voice on the other end of the line carried the weight of years, steady, grounded, and calm in a way that made Emma's heart ache. 490 acres, he said, his tone measured. That's what the court confirmed. The land in Natrona County, the one your great-grandfather donated to the state back in the 50s. It's officially yours again. The judge upheld the reversion clause. The title has been transferred to your name. Emma turned toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass. The words felt unreal. That land wasn't just property, it was history. Her family's story written into the soil of Wyoming. So, it's over, she whispered. Samuel exhaled. Legally, yes. But in truth? That depends on what happens next. He paused, and she could almost picture him sitting at his worn wooden desk back home, the Wyoming sunlight cutting across stacks of case files. I'd like to make it public, Emma. Not through the papers. Not through politics. I want to do it right. At the right time in the right room. Emma frowned slightly, understanding what he meant, but afraid to say it out loud. Uncle Sam, you're not thinking of. I am, he interrupted gently. You've spent 2 years swallowing their contempt, pretending not to hear their jokes. Tonight, you won't have to pretend anymore. His voice softened. You've carried their arrogance on your shoulders long enough. Tonight, the truth speaks for you. The line went quiet for a moment. Emma felt her pulse in her throat, steady and slow. Part of her wanted to protest, to say that she didn't want a scene, that she just wanted peace. But another part, a quieter, stronger part, understood. The same people who had laughed at her, who treated her like charity, were about to learn the one thing that terrified them most. She didn't need their approval. When the call ended, Emma stood in the still kitchen, holding the phone against her chest. The morning had brightened. A faint breeze slipped through the open window, carrying the smell of the Charles River and the hum of early traffic. Her gaze drifted toward the mirror above the sideboard. She saw a woman standing there, immaculately dressed, composed, expression unreadable. 2 years ago, that reflection would have shown someone else entirely. A girl fresh from the plains, nervous, eager to please. She remembered the first weeks in the Caldwell townhouse. Every dinner a silent performance, every word weighed carefully to avoid offense. She remembered Victoria's remarks disguised as jokes. People from small towns have such big dreams. The way Andrew would laugh politely and then glance at Emma, as if apologizing without daring to contradict his mother. The way servants, florists, and caterers took their cues from Victoria, how they spoke to Emma as if she were staff, not family. There had been nights when Emma sat alone in the guest parlor after everyone had gone to bed, staring out over the narrow streets of Beacon Hill. The air there was colder, heavier. It smelled of money, history, and secrets. She had tried to fit in, tried to mold herself into what they wanted, a perfect shadow. But even shadows had limits. Her hand brushed the edge of the marble counter. It was the same surface where Victoria left notes written in her precise handwriting. Reminders, corrections, expectations. Don't overcook the lamb. Don't wear red. Don't speak too much at dinner. The memories stung less now. They no longer defined her. They simply reminded her why this moment mattered. Upstairs, faint sounds echoed through the house. The creak of floorboards, the quiet rush of water through pipes. Somewhere in that maze of rooms, Victoria was already planning the perfect evening, unaware that everything she'd built on pride and pretense was about to crack. Emma lifted her chin, studying her own reflection again. The woman in the mirror met her gaze steadily, calm and unyielding. She wasn't the farm girl who'd arrived in Boston with trembling hands and hopeful eyes. That girl had disappeared the day she learned to smile through humiliation. What remained now was someone forged by silence, waiting for the moment to break it. And tonight she would. By late afternoon, the Caldwell townhouse no longer resembled a home, but a stage set for perfection. The faint scent of polished wood mingled with that of roses and lilies as staff hurried from room to room, following Victoria Caldwell's precise instructions. Every tablecloth was steamed twice, every candle positioned at a measured distance. Victoria stood at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, directing the household like an orchestra. The crystal glasses go on the right, not the left. And please, someone check the chandeliers for fingerprints. Her tone was sharp, impatient. Andrew followed her from room to room, saying little, occasionally nodding, his tie still loose around his neck. Emma moved quietly through the background, unnoticed by most. She wore the black dress Victoria had chosen for her, a simple cut, elegant but subdued. To look modest, not rustic, the older woman had said earlier, her voice laced with condescension. Emma hadn't argued. She rarely did anymore. The house gleamed with evening light. Through the tall windows, Beacon Hill shimmered gold, the kind of glow that only money could afford. In the grand dining room, long tables were adorned with china and silver engraved with the Caldwell crest. The chandelier above refracted the light into fragments that danced across the walls like sparks. By 6 o'clock, the caterers began to arrive, unloading trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne bottles. The pianist tested notes from the corner of the drawing room, letting soft jazz ripple through the house. It was elegant, restrained, exactly as Victoria liked it. Wealth without warmth. Emma passed by the grand mirror in the hallway and caught sight of herself again. The dress fit perfectly, but she felt as if she'd borrowed someone else's life for the evening. In the reflection behind her, Victoria's figure appeared, tall, poised, her dark green gown shimmering with sequins. Victoria glanced at Emma, her eyes scanning her like a critic evaluating a piece of art. "Better," she said simply. "At least you look like you belong here." Emma nodded, expression unreadable. The first guests arrived soon after. Laughter filled the foyer, mingled with the rustle of coats and the clinking of crystal. Boston's elite drifted in, judges, council members, old family friends with last names that carried weight. Every introduction came with a firm handshake and a polite smile. Emma stayed near Andrew, speaking only when addressed. Most of the guests offered her the kind of courtesy that came with curiosity rather than respect. "Ah, you're Andrew's wife," they'd say, as though confirming a rumor. In the sitting room, Victoria entertained a group of investors, her voice bright and confident. "Caldwell Development," she declared, "is preparing to expand westward. We've recently secured property rights in Wyoming, a vast area perfect for future estates." The name hit Emma like a jolt. Wyoming, her home. The land she'd just learned was once again hers. For a brief moment, the room seemed to blur. She steadied her glass of sparkling water, forcing herself to breathe. Andrew didn't notice. He was too busy listening to a colleague discuss market projections. Across the room, Victoria continued, unaware. "It's a rather desolate area," she said lightly. "But with the right investors, we can turn even the most barren land into opportunity." Emma's throat tightened. The words felt like a mockery, though Victoria had no idea of the irony. She excused herself quietly and stepped into the corridor, her heels barely making a sound on the marble floor. The clock in the hallway ticked toward 8. Her heart beat faster with each passing second, though she couldn't tell if it was dread or anticipation. And then 3 sharp chimes echoed through the house. The front door opened. A hush fell over the foyer as a man stepped inside, his presence instantly shifting the air. Samuel Lewis stood framed by the doorway, wearing an old gray suit that didn't quite fit the elegance of the room. In one hand he carried a small bouquet of autumn wildflowers, in the other a worn leather briefcase. Victoria's smile froze for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Well," she said smoothly, "how very unexpected." But Emma was already moving toward him, her breath catching. His plan, had just entered the room. The hum of conversation faltered the moment Samuel Lewis crossed the threshold. It wasn't his appearance that silenced the room. It was the quiet certainty in his posture, the calm of someone who belonged nowhere yet feared nothing. The warmth from the chandeliers seemed to dim around him, as if the house itself held its breath. Victoria recovered first. "Mr. Lewis," she greeted, her voice smooth but brittle at the edges. The polite smile she offered didn't reach her eyes. What a surprise! Samuel's gaze swept the room briefly before settling on her. "For the lady of the house," he said simply, extending the small bouquet of wildflowers. "Happy birthday." Victoria hesitated before accepting the flowers, her manicured fingers brushing the rough stems as though they might stain. "How thoughtful," she said, lips curving into a faint smile that barely concealed irritation. She handed the bouquet to a nearby server without looking. "Please, put these somewhere appropriate." Emma stepped forward. "Uncle Sam, let me show you to a seat." Her tone was calm, but her heart was pounding. He followed her to a quiet corner near the fireplace, where the low murmur of voices couldn't quite drown out the tension. A few guests turned to look, exchanging glances. Their whispers carried the same tone Boston's elite reserved for anything unfamiliar. Curiosity laced with superiority. One man chuckled softly to his companion. "A bit underdressed for the occasion, isn't he?" Samuel heard it, but didn't react. He simply unbuttoned his coat, placed the worn briefcase beside his chair, and folded his hands. Emma leaned toward him and whispered, "You didn't have to come all this way." He smiled faintly. "I did. Some truths need to be told in person." Across the room, Victoria resumed her performance as hostess, raising her glass. "Now, as I was saying," her voice regained its brightness, as if she could erase the discomfort with confidence. "Caldwell Development has recently acquired a rather extensive property out west. Beautiful area, Wyoming if I'm not mistaken. Practically untouched land. We'll be transforming it into a high-end community within a few years." Applause rippled among the guests. Someone toasted, "To new frontiers!" Emma's breath caught in her throat. The blood drained from her face as she gripped her glass. The project Victoria boasted about, it was the same 490 acres her great-grandfather had donated decades ago. The land Samuel had just told her was legally hers. She turned her head slightly, meeting Samuel's eyes from across the room. He gave no outward sign of emotion, only adjusted his glasses and continued to observe. His calm steadiness anchored her, even as her pulse raced. Victoria went on, laughing lightly. "I must say, some people still cling to sentimental notions about land and legacy. But progress waits for no one, does it?" The guests chuckled approvingly. Emma felt something inside her twist, part anger, part disbelief. She had imagined this moment 100 times, the arrogance, the unthinking cruelty, the laughter. Now it was real. Her fingers trembled slightly as she set down her drink. The crystal clinked against the table, drawing a few eyes. Samuel rose quietly from his chair and moved closer, his presence both grounding and defiant. When he reached her side, he spoke in a low voice only she could hear. "Wait," he murmured, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Just wait." The music resumed, and the conversation swelled again. But for Emma, every sound in the room faded into a distant hum. The air seemed to vibrate with the weight of something inevitable, like a storm gathering beyond the polished windows of Beacon Hill. By the time dessert was served, the polished elegance of the evening had dissolved into the warm haze of wine and laughter. The guests had relaxed, voices rising over the soft piano in the corner. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her glass half full and her confidence overflowing. The birthday glow suited her. Perfect lighting, perfect guests, perfect audience. She leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine. You know, she began, her tone playful, we all adore Emma. She's such a dear, so refreshingly unpolished. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the table. Emma froze for a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening around her napkin. Victoria continued, her eyes glinting with amusement. When she first moved here from Wyoming, she asked me if she could plant potatoes on the balcony. Potatoes! She laughed, a bright, brittle sound. I told her, darling, this is Beacon Hill, not a barnyard. The room erupted in laughter, soft at first, then louder, as others joined in, eager to please their hostess. One of the men chuckled. That's charming, he said. So authentic. Andrew forced a smile, his jaw tense. Mom, he said quietly, maybe— Oh, come now, Andrew, she interrupted smoothly. It's just a story. Emma's gaze was fixed on her plate. Her face remained calm, but something had changed in her eyes. The warmth that once lived there had cooled to glass. She didn't look embarrassed anymore, only detached, like she was watching from a distance. Across the table, Samuel's expression darkened. His hand rested on the worn leather of his briefcase, thumb tracing the seam. He said nothing, but his stillness carried weight. Victoria, oblivious, lifted her glass again. It's funny, isn't it? How life works. That little town where she grew up, what's it called, Emma? Casper. Emma looked up, her voice even. Near there. Right, Victoria said, smiling. Well, as fate would have it, our company's newest project is set to rise right on that very land. Imagine, from potato fields to luxury estates. Quite the transformation. The laughter returned, muted this time. A few guests glanced at Emma, unsure whether to smile. Victoria's tone softened into mock sympathy. Don't worry, dear. I promise we'll build something tasteful. Perhaps we'll even name one of the cul-de-sacs after your family. Lewis Lane has a ring to it, doesn't it? The laughter that followed was quieter now, edged with discomfort. Even Andrew couldn't meet his wife's eyes. Samuel drew a long breath through his nose, his fingers curling tighter around the handle of the briefcase. His composure remained, but the muscle in his jaw shifted. Emma didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on Victoria's face, not in anger, but in clarity. Every cruel word, every attempt at humiliation, landed not like a wound, but a confirmation. This was who Victoria Caldwell truly was, someone who built her identity on the degradation of others. The music changed, a slower tune, softer. The pianist must have sensed the tension. Victoria raised her glass again, as if to reclaim control. Anyway, she said, the land's practically worthless now. Just empty hills and dust. But with the right investors, we'll make it shine. She clinked glasses with George Whitmore, who smiled tightly. To progress, he said. Samuel stood then, slowly, deliberately. The motion was small, but it drew the room's attention. He didn't speak yet. He just looked at Emma, then at Victoria. Victoria blinked, surprised. Mr. Lewis, is something wrong? Samuel's gaze was steady, his voice low but firm. No, ma'am, he said. Just a moment of reflection. He glanced down at his briefcase, then back at her. Enough, he murmured, almost to himself. The single word hung in the air like the sharp note of a violin cutting through an orchestra. Emma's breath hitched, the noise of the party fading to a distant echo. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed faintly in the Boston night, rising and falling like the warning of a storm yet to break. The murmur of voices faded as Samuel stepped forward, the faint scrape of his chair against the hardwood echoing through the room. He moved with the quiet assurance of someone who did not need permission to speak. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, even the music from the piano, all fell away until the only sound was the soft hum of the chandelier above. "Forgive me, Mrs. Caldwell," Samuel began, his tone measured but carrying easily across the room. "But I think your guests deserve to know who your daughter-in-law truly is." Every head turned toward him. The words landed like a drop of ink in clear water, spreading fast. Victoria's smile faltered. "Excuse me," she said, half laughing, the edges of her voice tightening. Samuel met her gaze evenly. "I've been following your remarks about the development in Wyoming. Quite a remarkable project. However," he paused, letting the silence grow taut, "there's something you may have overlooked." He reached down and unclasped the old briefcase resting at his feet. The sound of the metal snaps echoed like a gavel. From within, he withdrew a neat stack of documents, their corners sharp, the top page bearing a crisp red seal of the District Court of Natrona County, Wyoming. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a certified court order, signed and entered 2 days ago. It confirms the rightful ownership of the Lewis estate for 190 acres of land previously under dispute." The air thickened. Someone coughed nervously. Samuel's eyes moved across the faces of the guests before settling on Victoria. "The court has recognized that the land in question," he allowed himself a deliberate pause, "legally belongs to Mrs. Emma Caldwell." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even the pianist's hands froze above the keys. Victoria blinked rapidly, as if trying to process the words. What nonsense is this?" she stammered. Andrew turned toward Emma, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Emma." But Emma didn't move. She stood tall beside Samuel, the flickering light of the chandelier catching the calm determination in her face. Gone was the quiet woman who had spent years fading into the background. In her place stood someone unshakable. Samuel continued, his voice clear, calm, and judicial. "The property your company attempted to acquire through a network of shell corporations, some registered under false addresses, some under fictitious names, was found to have originated from a charitable deed executed by Emma's great-grandfather. The deed included a reversion clause, which the court has now enforced. The land reverts to the Lewis family, to her." The silence that followed was absolute. George Whitmore, seated near Victoria, shifted uneasily in his chair. "That can't be right," he muttered. "Those transactions were cleared. They were fraudulent," Samuel said sharply, his tone still courteous but edged with authority. The evidence was presented before the court. Wire transfers, forged titles, falsified environmental assessments, all traced back to companies connected to Caldwell Development and Whitmore and Associates. Victoria's hand trembled as she reached for her glass of wine, the liquid trembling with her. "You're making accusations in my home." "I'm presenting facts," Samuel replied evenly, "and those facts are now part of the public record." He placed the documents on the table nearest her, the sound of paper against wood loud in the stillness. All eyes were on Victoria now, her painted calm cracking, her fingers clutching the stem of her glass too tightly. Emma's voice, when it came, was steady and cold. "I knew you were proud of that project," she said softly. "I just didn't realize you were building it on my family's grave." Victoria's breath hitched. The glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the floor, red wine bleeding into the rug like spilled blood. No one moved. Samuel stood quietly, his gaze unwavering. "Justice has a way of arriving," he said, his tone no longer sharp, but almost gentle. "Sometimes late, sometimes inconvenient, but always on time." The chandelier light trembled above them, its reflection glinting off the scattered shards at Victoria's feet. The woman who had built her life on control could only stare down at the fragments, realizing too late that they mirrored her own. Victoria's eyes darted across the room, searching for someone, anyone, to speak, to disprove what she'd just heard. But the silence was unrelenting. Her guests looked everywhere but at her. Their smiles had faded, replaced by that uneasy stillness that follows a scandal before it's named aloud. George Whitmore rose slowly from his chair, his face pale beneath the warm chandelier light. He reached for the papers Samuel had placed on the table, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. The room was so quiet that every turn of the paper sounded like a blade cutting the air. His voice came out unsteady. These are certified filings. District Court, Natrona County. His eyes scanned downward, disbelief draining the color from his face. Signed by Judge Mackenzie. This is legitimate. Victoria's throat tightened. George, say something. Tell them this isn't true. He looked at her helplessly. Victoria, these are official court orders. There's nothing I can say. The realization struck like a physical blow. The years of scheming, the layers of charm and manipulation, all of it crumbled in an instant. The perfect facade she'd curated for decades shattered under the weight of a seal and a signature. Samuel's tone remained steady, clinical, almost prosecutorial. The investigation began 3 years ago, he said, addressing the room, not just her. We traced a series of shell corporations, Back Bay Holdings, Meridian Group, and Caldwell West LLC, all registered to non-existent offices in Boston and Cheyenne. Each one funneled acquisition funds through Whitmore and Associates. The total value exceeded $40 million. Gasps rippled through the guests. Someone whispered, 40 million. Another murmured, fraud. Samuel continued as if they weren't there. Wire transfers led to personal accounts linked to your executives. Bribes paid to county clerks. Fabricated environmental reports. It was all buried under enough paperwork to outlast a generation, until someone decided to read between the lines. He glanced briefly at Emma, then back to Victoria, until justice caught up. Victoria's lips moved, but no words came out. Andrew stood, his face ashen. Emma, you knew? His voice trembled. All this time. Emma turned toward him, her expression calm, but not unkind. I did. I stayed silent to see who truly cared, me or my name. Her words landed with quiet devastation. Andrew staggered back, one hand to his temple. I thought you were just different, that you didn't belong in this world. I didn't, she said softly, but I learned to survive in it. He looked away, shame and confusion warring in his eyes. Victoria found her voice again, brittle and breaking. You had no right, she hissed. Coming into my home, embarrassing me in front of my friends. Samuel interrupted her gently but firmly. I'm not here to embarrass you, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm here to tell the truth. Justice isn't revenge. It's the truth that finally comes home. His words lingered, heavy and absolute. Victoria stared at him, her breathing uneven. You think this is justice, she spat weakly. You've destroyed everything. No, he said quietly. You did that yourself. The chandelier light glimmered across her trembling hands. Around her, the once lively crowd had turned into a silent audience. No one laughed now. No one dared move. The empire she had built on intimidation and charm lay in ruins before them. Victoria stumbled backward into her chair. The strength in her posture, the command that once filled every room, was gone. She looked suddenly small, like a queen who'd outlived her throne. George closed the folder slowly, setting it back on the table as if afraid to touch it any longer. Samuel turned to Emma, his voice softer now. It's over, he said. The truth has done its work. Emma nodded once, the faintest hint of relief breaking through the tension in her face. Victoria sank deeper into her chair, eyes glassy, lips parted in disbelief. Around her, the crystal glasses gleamed like witnesses to her undoing. The laughter, the control, the power, all of it gone. In that moment, the woman who had once ruled Beacon Hill with grace and iron sat surrounded by silence, and for the first time in her life, no one dared to look her in the eye. The room had not yet recovered from the blow when Victoria broke. Her composure, once her greatest weapon, splintered like thin glass under the weight of humiliation. This is a setup, she shouted, voice shrill and uneven. You're conspiring against me. All of you. She pushed herself up from the chair, eyes wild, scanning the guests who suddenly seemed very interested in their glasses and the floor. You think I'd risk my name, my family, for some backwater plot of dirt?" Her hand trembled as she pointed toward Samuel. You're behind this. You planted those documents." Samuel didn't flinch. He reached calmly into his briefcase once more and withdrew another set of files, thicker this time, bound neatly with a red ribbon. "These," he said, setting them on the table, "are certified copies of the court's seizure orders. Here you'll find the full record of the investigation. Shell companies' financial trails, land seizure reports, and your own executive's depositions. Everything cross-verified by the state attorney's office." He spoke not with triumph, but with quiet finality. "No one here needs to believe me, Mrs. Caldwell. The law already does." Victoria's chest rose and fell rapidly, her voice cracking. "No, you don't understand. Those were George's filings, not mine." George Whitmore's face had drained of all color. He shook his head slowly, despair etched into every line. "Victoria, please don't." She turned to him, desperate. "Tell them it's not true. Tell them we didn't, but George couldn't." He stared at the documents, the evidence that bound them both. "It's over," he whispered. "Caldwell Estates is finished. The accounts are frozen, the permits revoked. They already moved in to audit the firm this morning." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the table to stay upright. The guest's eyes flickered with discomfort, some pity, some relief, most just stunned silence. The Queen of Beacon Hill had fallen, and no one dared reach for her crown. Emma stood nearby, still and silent. Her calm presence only magnified the chaos unraveling around her. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply watched, her face unreadable, her hands clasped loosely before her. Andrew took a step toward her, his expression stricken. "Emma, please," he said softly, his voice breaking. "We can fix this. We'll figure it out, whatever it takes." She looked at him, and for a moment he almost believed she might reach for his hand. But she didn't. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. "I can fix my life," she said, "not yours." The words hit harder than any accusation. Andrew's face crumpled. He took a step back as if struck. Victoria slumped into her chair, sobbing now, muttering half-coherent denials, lies, betrayal, injustice, while Samuel stood unmoving, his gaze heavy but not cruel. He didn't enjoy her collapse. It was simply the conclusion of what had already been written. Emma turned to him. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once. Justice was overdue. The clock on the mantel struck 10, the chime echoing through the silence. Emma looked around the grand room one last time. The chandeliers, the portraits, the perfection she had once tried to live up to. It all felt lifeless now, hollow. She reached for her clutch and slipped her wedding ring inside. "Tomorrow morning," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else, "I'll file the divorce papers." Then she walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble, each step steady, unhurried, final. Behind her, the sound of Victoria's sobs mingled with the faint rustle of papers, the sound of an empire dissolving. When the door closed, the house exhaled, and for the first time in years, the silence belonged to someone else. Emma had nearly reached the door when she stopped. The quiet in the room was oppressive, the kind of silence that followed after everything worth saying had already been said. She turned back toward Samuel, her voice steady but low. "Tell them the rest, Uncle." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. Setting his briefcase on the table once more, he faced the room, the powerful, the curious, the suddenly small. His tone shifted, softer now, no longer that of a prosecutor but of a man laying a burden down. "Most of you don't know who I am beyond the papers I brought," he began. "But my connection to Emma didn't start with a courtroom." He glanced toward the window, where the lights of Beacon Hill shimmered faintly beyond the glass. "Her mother, Nina Lewis, was my first and only love. We grew up together on that same Wyoming land you were so eager to pave over. But she married another man, a good one. And when he died, She was left with a daughter and nothing else. Samuel's voice caught for the first time that evening. I wanted to marry her then. I wanted to give her stability, but she refused. She said love couldn't replace memory, that she owed her loyalty to the man she'd lost. So instead I stayed nearby. I helped when I could, and when she got sick, I promised her I'd look after Emma. He turned toward the young woman, standing by the doorway. I made a vow at her bedside. I swore that no one would ever take advantage of her kindness, or make her feel small for where she came from. Tonight, he said quietly, I kept that promise. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. The same guests who had laughed moments earlier now looked down at their hands, suddenly unsure of themselves. Andrew stood motionless near the table, his mind racing. He had thought this was about property, about money, about revenge, but now he saw it clearly. This was legacy. It wasn't just Emma reclaiming her family's land. It was Samuel finishing something that had begun decades before, a wound passed through generations that had finally healed in truth. He spoke softly, almost to himself. This wasn't about the estate, it was about justice. For her family. For all of you. Samuel met his eyes. Justice doesn't choose sides, Andrew. It just waits. And when it arrives, it doesn't shout. It simply stands there, undeniable. Andrew looked down, shame creeping through him like a slow burn. He thought of all the dinners where he'd stayed silent while his mother belittled Emma, all the moments he'd convinced himself that neutrality was kindness. Now he saw it for what it was, cowardice. Across the table, Victoria sat slumped in her chair, the remnants of her dignity scattered like the shards of her broken glass. Her breathing had steadied, but her eyes glistened. For the first time in her life, she couldn't find the words to defend herself. Samuel turned toward her, his tone no longer stern. Mrs. Caldwell, he said quietly, you've spent years teaching others what class looks like. Maybe tonight will remind you what it sounds like. Victoria's gaze fell to the floor. No reply came. The silence that followed wasn't defiance, it was surrender. For the first time in her carefully orchestrated life, she felt the sharp edge of shame, not because she'd been exposed, but because she finally saw the truth staring back at her. Samuel exhaled slowly, closing his briefcase one last time. The sound echoed through the room like a gavel striking wood. That's all I have to say, he murmured. Emma gave him a small nod, one of gratitude, one of farewell, and turned again toward the door. Behind her, the weight of 3 generations seemed to settle into stillness, and for a brief, fragile moment, even Victoria Caldwell bowed her head. The city lights of Boston faded in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the vast stretch of highway and the endless dark. The Caldwell townhouse, with its chandeliers and polished marble floors, grew smaller in memory with every passing mile. Inside the old sedan, the air was quiet except for the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic sweep of the wipers cutting through light rain. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her head resting lightly against the window. The reflection, staring back at her, no longer belonged to the woman who had stood silent in another woman's house. It was steadier now, older but freer. Samuel drove beside her, his hands firm on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The road stretched westward, long and empty, toward a sky that promised change. Neither spoke for hours. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was peaceful, a shared understanding that words were no longer necessary. Every mile carried them closer to where everything had begun, and where something new could finally start. Just before dawn, they crossed into Wyoming. The air shifted, crisper, cleaner, filled with the faint scent of sagebrush and soil damp from morning dew. Emma rolled down her window, letting the cold wind sting her cheeks. The sight of the open plains made her chest tighten. The same land her family had once lost, now hers again. When the headlights finally illuminated a small wooden house on the edge of a field, Emma smiled through the exhaustion. The porch light flickered faintly in the distance, and a figure stood waiting in the doorway. Nina Lewis had aged. but the warmth in her eyes was untouched. She ran down the steps before the car had even stopped, her robe trailing behind her in the dawn breeze. "Emma!" she called out, voice breaking. Emma barely managed to open the door before her mother's arms wrapped around her. The world seemed to collapse into that one moment. The smell of home, the familiar heartbeat, the safety she hadn't felt in years. Tears came easily, not from sadness, but from the release of everything she'd carried. Samuel stepped out of the car, watching them quietly. His eyes softened as he saw the two women holding each other, framed by the first blush of morning light. When Emma finally pulled away, she wiped her face and laughed softly. "You waited up." "I told you I always would," Nina said, smiling through her tears. Then she looked past her daughter, and her breath caught. "Samuel." He approached slowly, removing his hat like a man unsure if he still had the right. "Hello, Nina." For a moment, the years between them seemed to vanish. They stood facing each other under the pale light of dawn, two people bound by time, silence, and a promise that had outlived regret. "There's something I need to tell you," Samuel said quietly. "Something I should have said 30 years ago." Nina's eyes glistened. "You don't have to." "I do," he replied. "I loved you then. I never stopped." She smiled faintly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I know." Emma stood by the doorway, watching them through the window. The tenderness between them was simple, unspoken, the kind that didn't ask for forgiveness because it was already given. She stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath her feet, and breathed in the scent of cedar and tea. The house was small, humble, and filled with warmth. Behind her, the murmur of their voices faded beneath the vast Wyoming sky. As dawn broke fully, light spilled over the fields, endless waves of gold stretching toward the horizon. Emma looked out through the window, the wind catching her hair. The land shimmered, alive again, free again. Justice had come full circle, and peace, quiet, lasting peace, had finally returned.